when I introduced Perspectiva and explained what we were trying to do, and I said broadly, as Pippa mentioned, many people in the world are working on political change in different ways. They're trying to solve complex problems. And many people are working on inner transformation and trying to help people overcome certain psychological barriers and seeking a certain spiritual growth maybe. But these two worlds don't connect very often. And when they do, it's not a very grounded and empowered phenomenon. It's often a bit niche and a bit transitory or on the side in some way. I wanted to make it much more mainstream. But to do that, I felt you had to do certain things better. So one of them was, you've got to be able to speak, on the one hand, of the spirit and the capacity to break your heart open and to feel utterly vulnerable and not have a clue what's going on in the world. But at the same time, you have to speak the language of capital and technology and power, and not to feel these are parts of different worlds. So that was the challenge. How do you make this the norm? Make this the go-to issue? And for that, you need an organizational vessel, and you need to build networks, and you need to build bodies of understanding and language and concepts and evidence. And you need to have events and bring people on board. So it's not just a book here and there, but actually the sort of beginnings of a sort of network becoming movement, becoming a source of political hope in the long term. Now, that's a 100-year project. That's not something you do the next day. But the point is to commit seriously to the long term means going that deep. And I'm going to try and explain why. So the first thing I want to say is on why. Why this? Why do we need this at all? Why can't we just, work on economic growth and get everyone a bit richer and out of poverty, a bit of technological improvement, maybe some more renewable energy, keep democracy more or less afloat, and just hope that it all somehow holds together. So I don't know about you, but my political orientation and the reason I created Perspectiva is I don't buy that anymore. I don't actually think we can shore up. I think we have to build something new, something entirely new, but not in the language of revolution, of breaking things down, but in the language of emergence, and that's what I want to speak about in terms of Plan E. But I'm just going to briefly say why I think the crisis that we face is of a particular kind. It's not just a litany of problems, because according to the data, the world is arguably doing better than ever before. So you have to tell a better story about why, in one way, things are better than they've ever been, and yet we have to completely change course. It's a much more subtle, difficult message, but that's the one that I think is the true message. And the reason for that is the nature of the crisis. So I think of them as economic, ecological, epistemic, existential, emotional, and ethical. Okay? Now, the economic and the ecological are relatively familiar to everyone. But those things are often where politics stays. Politics often stays within those two realms. And what you actually need is a deeper engagement with the inner world that lies within them, what I sometimes call the meta-crisis. And those are factors like, ethically, what are our values, norms, and rights? If our public debate got better at speaking about the good and what it was for us and how we should get there, we'd be in a much better position. But that's hard because of what I call the epistemic crisis, which is how we know, and the war on truth. And then you have something to do with the kind of existential meaning and purpose question. For many decades, there was no issue of meaning of life. It was just given unto you. Only in the last few decades has the question of who we are and how we should live become paramount. And that's happening at the same time as these other crises. And then finally, emotionally, there's just a question of how to feel. The gap between our instincts, our evolved instincts to feel certain things in response to certain phenomena, is just at odds with the actual issues of the day. There is no intuitive response to climate change. There is no felt sense of what's going on. So there's a real ethical crisis, a real epistemic crisis, a real emotional crisis, and you realize I'm running out of this now, economic, ecological, and existential. These are all real crises. So when I speak of Plan E, I speak of what would a world look like where we begin to understand the world at that level, when we understand those E's coming together. As many of you know from CV, curriculum vitae means the course of my life. Curriculum literally means to run the course of something. But the hidden curriculum, the work we have to do in ourselves, is something quite different. The hidden curriculum is partly waking up, which means being aware of some of those things I've just mentioned, but also spiritually waking up. So not just politically, which is a fuller awareness of all the things that are shaping us, but spiritually in the sense of realizing how the self constructs experience, the fact that we're in autopilot virtually all of the time. And then there's the issue of growing up, the infantilization of culture through media particularly, but also through difficulty of taking responsibility for the issues of our time that I've mentioned that seem too big, too enormous for us to grasp. But to really grow into them, we have to actually mature in mental complexity, in emotional depth and capacity, in willpower. And then wising up is the hardest of all. Wising up is what we have to do together. Wising up is the shaping of society through institutions and cultural forms and patterns of interaction and language. We build that together. We actually create the world together, but we haven't figured out how to do it yet. So those are grand aims, and that's why it's a 100-year project. But that's what Perspectiva is about. We hope to grow gradually, and through that to affect change in all sorts of subtle ways that we can't predict. But we begin where you are, right? We begin here and now tonight with something very experimental, something speculative, something hopefully fun, to give you a little gist of what we just spoke about, particularly in terms of waking up, growing up and wising up.
But what's really important is the idea that you are all part of one thing. What we wanted to do was put Jonathan's idea of the 6 E's into practice, because verbally it's quite a tricky concept to take on. So we got 12 volunteers to walk around representing all of those different versions of the E's and watching them integrate with each other. And then they were reading quotes that represented their particular E word, and they were reading them to each other, and they were polar opposites. And so it was really about the idea that often we are shouting with our backs turned to each other. About the polar opposite of things, when maybe perhaps we should be looking at someone who's actually involved in a different area, and maybe that's where the answer lies. That's maybe where the actual conversations are.
I think the last exercise really brought home all the E's. I mean, they really came alive to me, because when Jonathan was speaking initially, I was trying, oh, so that's 4 E's, and what's the 5th one, what's the 6th one? But by the last exercise, I knew what it was, and I also knew what I felt about each of those labels, and I desperately wanted to swap my ethical optimist for emotional optimism, but they wouldn't let me. So
the point that we just got to was speaking about how both the optimistic and the pessimistic view are correct. There's not one that is truer than the other, but that if we take them both as true and use that as a premise to design from, then we can think about ways to make the world better rather than just get depressed about how it's got worse.
I've loved the conversation. I think this is all about dialogue across all the different things, creating the opportunity to have these dialogues, to grapple with different ideas, and to get past the kind of the binary kind of optimism, positivism and pessimism, and say, actually, well, what's this in between, and how can we use these tensions to discover different ways of thinking and to think about different kinds of solutions. It's a great opportunity for those. Hope we do more of them.
This is a really good playful space to explore what lies just below the surface. And it's opened something up, I think. I don't know where we've got to, but it's like opening, and there's a lot of, there's a bit of fizzing going on now, and I think people will want to come to the next one.